The massive ship came out of nowhere on a cold December morning in the year 2247. It was bigger than anything humanity had ever built. It was bigger than most cities. The dark metal hull blocked out the sun over half of Europe as it hung in the sky like a mountain that had learned to fly. People stopped in the streets and looked up. Some screamed. Some prayed. Some simply stood there with their mouths open, unable to understand what they were seeing. Within 3 hours, every television, every radio, every phone, and every computer on Earth received the same message. The transmission cut through all signals and all frequencies. There was no escaping it. A face appeared on screens around the world. It was not human. The creature had gray skin stretched tight over a skull that was too long and too narrow. Its eyes were black pools with no whites and no pupils. When it spoke, its voice was cold and empty like wind blowing through a dead forest. The creature called itself Vexer Prime. It said it spoke for the Galactic Council, a union of 12 ancient species that had ruled this part of the galaxy for over 10,000 years. It said that humanity had been watched for a very long time. It said that the Council had waited until humans developed space travel before making contact. And now the time had come for humanity to take its place in the galactic order. But that place was not as equals. That place was at the bottom. Vexer Prime explained the terms without emotion. Humanity would become a tributary species. This meant that 30% of all minerals and resources extracted from Earth and its colonies would be sent to the Council each year. It meant that 10 million humans would be selected annually to work in labor colonies across the galaxy. It meant that Earth's military would be disbanded and all warships would be destroyed. In exchange, the Council would allow humanity to continue existing. The creature paused and let its black eyes stare into the cameras. Every species in the galaxy had accepted these terms. It said, the Krellians had accepted. The Mordavians had accepted. The Vexeri themselves had once been tributaries before they earned their place on the Council. This was the natural order. The strong ruled and the weak served. Humanity had 90 days to prepare its first tribute shipment and to begin the process of disarmament. If humanity refused, the Council would send its fleet. And where the fleet went, only ashes remained. The transmission ended. The screens went dark. And for a long moment, the entire planet was silent. Admiral Daniel Cross was 62 years old. He had gray hair cut short and a face marked by decades of hard service. He had fought in the Mars Rebellion when the colonists tried to break away from Earth. He had commanded the defense of Jupiter Station when pirates attacked the fuel depots. He had buried friends and enemies alike across the solar system. He had seen humanity at its worst and at its best. And as he stood in the United Earth Defense Command Center watching the alien message play again on the main screen, he felt something he had not felt in a very long time. He felt angry. Secretary General Lisa Monroe called an emergency session of the United Earth Parliament within hours of the transmission. Representatives from every nation gathered in the Great Hall in Geneva. The room was filled with fear. Cross could see it on their faces as he took his seat in the military advisory section. These were politicians and diplomats. They were used to solving problems with words and compromises. They were not prepared for this. Monroe stood at the podium. She was a tall woman with dark skin and silver hair. She had been a lawyer before she entered politics, and she spoke with the careful precision of someone who weighed every word. She read the tribute demands aloud so that there could be no misunderstanding. 30% of resources. 10 million people per year. Complete disarmament. The chamber erupted. Some representatives shouted that they should negotiate. Perhaps the Council would accept less. Perhaps there was room for discussion. Others wept openly and said that resistance was suicide. The alien ship above Europe was proof enough that the Council had technology far beyond anything humanity possessed. Fighting would only lead to extinction. A representative from the Asian coalition stood and argued that submission was the only logical choice. Survival mattered more than pride. Their children could live as servants, but at least they would live. Cross listened to all of it. He listened to the fear and the desperation and the willingness to bend. And when there was a pause in the shouting, he stood up. The room went quiet. Everyone knew who Daniel Cross was. Everyone knew what he had done for Earth over 4 decades of service. When he spoke, people listened. He walked slowly to the front of the chamber. He did not ask for permission. He simply took his place beside the podium and looked out at the assembled representatives of humanity. He told them that he understood their fear. He told them that the alien ship was terrifying and that the Council's power was real. He did not pretend that fighting would be easy or that victory was certain. He was a soldier, not a fool. But then he asked them a question. He asked them to think about every struggle humanity had ever faced. He asked them to remember the ice ages when their ancestors had survived with nothing but fire and stone tools. He asked them to remember the plagues that had killed millions and the wars that had nearly destroyed civilization. He asked them to remember every time someone had told humanity that the situation was hopeless and that surrender was the only option. And then he asked them what their answer had always been. Humanity did not crawl out of the caves and cross the oceans and reach for the stars just to become slaves, he said. Humanity did not survive ice and fire and blood just to kneel before some council of aliens who thought fear was the same as power. He looked at the representative who had argued for submission. Your children might live as servants, he said, but they would not be living. They would just be existing. And that was not something he was willing to accept. Secretary General Monroe called for a vote. The question was simple. Would humanity submit to the Council's demands, or would humanity refuse? The vote was unanimous. Earth's response was sent to the alien ship that same night. It was a single word transmitted in every language known to humanity, and translated into the Council's primary tongue. The Galactic Council had demanded tribute. Humanity had refused to kneel, and now there was no turning back. The Council gave humanity 90 days to reconsider. They expected panic. They expected riots in the streets and governments collapsing under the weight of public fear. They expected humanity to crawl back with apologies and offers of even greater tribute. That was what always happened. That was what every species had done for 10,000 years. But humanity did something the Council had never seen before. Humanity got to work. Commander Nathan Price was 41 years old and had spent most of his adult life on the moon. He knew Luna Base better than he knew Earth. He knew every tunnel and every dome and every mining shaft that had been carved into the gray rock over the past century. And when the orders came down from Admiral Cross, he knew exactly what needed to be done. The mining facilities were converted first. Equipment that had been designed to extract helium-3 and rare minerals was modified to produce weapons. Plasma conduits became rifle barrels. Industrial lasers became cutting beams for ship hulls. The fabrication plants that once made replacement parts for civilian transports began churning out missile casings and armor plating. Workers who had spent their lives as miners became soldiers. They trained in the low gravity of the lunar surface, learning to fight in conditions that no alien species would expect. They practiced moving through tunnels and around craters. They learned to use the environment as a weapon. On Mars, General Kevin Shaw took command of the Colonial Defense Forces. Mars had always attracted a certain type of person: pioneers, risk-takers, people who were willing to leave everything behind for the chance to build something new. These were not soft people. These were people who had survived dust storms and equipment failures and the constant threat of death on a hostile world. Shaw gave them weapons and told them to train. Colonists who had never fired a gun before learned to shoot. Engineers who had designed habitats learned to design fortifications. Farmers who had grown food in red soil learned to grow explosives in underground labs. The factories on Mars switched production almost overnight. Agricultural equipment was melted down and recast as armored vehicles. Construction drones were reprogrammed to dig defensive trenches. Every resource on the planet was directed toward a single goal: survival. Back on Earth, Dr. Megan Torres led the effort to build a fleet. She was the chief engineer of the orbital shipyards, a complex of massive construction platforms that circled the planet. Before the Council's message, she had been working on a new generation of cargo vessels designed to carry supplies to the outer colonies. Now she was building warships. Torres worked her teams around the clock. She eliminated sleep breaks and meal times. She pushed her engineers until they collapsed, and then pushed them some more. They did not complain. They understood what was at stake. In 90 days, the shipyards produced more warships than Earth had built in the previous 10 years. The vessels were not elegant. They were not designed for long journeys or comfortable travel. They were built for one purpose only: to fight and to kill. Captain Amy Rodriguez led the intelligence effort. She was a small woman with sharp eyes and a mind that never stopped working. Her job was to understand the enemy, and she attacked that job with everything she had. Rodriguez and her team analyzed every piece of data they could find about the Council. They studied the alien ship hovering over Europe. They intercepted transmissions and broke encryption codes. They pieced together fragments of information from old space probes that had detected Council activity near the edge of the solar system decades ago. What she discovered gave her hope. The Galactic Council had not fought a real war in over 800 years. Their fleet was vast and powerful, but it was designed for intimidation rather than combat. Their tactics had not changed in centuries because they had never needed to change. Every species they encountered surrendered before the first shot was fired. The Council had forgotten what it meant to face an enemy who would rather die than submit. Rodriguez presented her findings to Admiral Cross. The Council was arrogant. She explained. They expected humanity to behave like every other species they had conquered. They expected fear to do their work for them. Cross smiled for the first time since the alien message had arrived. The Council also sent observers to watch humanity during the 90 days. They wanted to monitor the panic and the collapse. They wanted to record the suffering so they could show it to other species as a warning. What they recorded instead was something that disturbed them deeply. They saw factories operating day and night. They saw soldiers training with fierce determination. They saw scientists working on weapons that should have taken years to develop. They saw a planet that was not falling apart but coming together. The observers sent their reports back to the Council homeworld. The elder species read the reports and felt something unfamiliar stirring in their ancient hearts. It was a feeling they had not experienced in a very long time. It was doubt. Secretary General Monroe addressed humanity one final time before the deadline expired. She stood in front of a camera in the Parliament building and spoke directly to every person on Earth, Mars, Luna, and the outer colonies. She told them that the Council believed humanity was weak because humanity was young. She told them that the Council expected humanity to break because humanity was small compared to their vast empire. She told them that the Council had made a terrible mistake. Humanity had never been given anything, she said. Every step forward had been earned through blood and sweat and sacrifice. Every challenge had been met and overcome. Ice ages and plagues and wars and disasters. Humanity had faced them all and survived them all. The Council thought that fear was power. she said. But real power was not about making others afraid. Real power was about refusing to be afraid yourself. When the 90 days ended, the Council fleet jumped into the solar system. 2,000 warships emerged from hyperspace near the orbit of Neptune. It was the largest military force the galaxy had ever seen assembled in one place. The fleet carried enough firepower to destroy a dozen planets. The Council commanders expected to find a broken species waiting to surrender. Instead, they found something else entirely. They found every ship that humanity had built formed into a battle line between the fleet and Earth. They found weapons platforms hidden in asteroids and defense satellites orbiting every colony. They found a species that had transformed itself in 90 days from a collection of scattered settlements into a fortress. And at the head of the human fleet, Admiral Daniel Cross sat on the bridge of his carrier and watched the Council armada approach. He opened a channel that every ship on both sides could hear. "Come and take it," he said. The Battle of Earth was about to begin. The first shots were fired near the asteroid belt. Hidden among the tumbling rocks were weapons platforms that humanity had placed there, in secret during the 90 days of preparation. The platforms were simple things. Just railguns bolted to chunks of metal with basic targeting computers. But simple did not mean weak. The Council fleet moved in standard formation. It was the same formation they had used for 800 years. Large capital ships in the center with smaller escorts spread out in protective rings. The formation was designed to look impressive and intimidating. It was designed to make enemies surrender before combat even began. Council commanders did not expect the asteroids to start shooting. The first railgun round was a chunk of iron accelerated to 5% of light speed. It hit a Council cruiser dead center and punched through the hull like a needle through paper. The ship's shields were designed to absorb energy weapons. They were not designed for solid projectiles moving faster than anything the Council had ever faced. 12 Council cruisers were destroyed in the first 30 seconds. The explosions lit up the darkness of space like new stars being born. Admiral Cross watched from the bridge of his carrier, the Defiance. The ship was not beautiful. It was a blocky mass of armor and weapons, cobbled together from cargo vessels and mining platforms. But it was tough, and it was deadly. Beside him stood Commander Nathan Price and Lieutenant Chris Palmer, his tactical officer. They had trained together for weeks. They had run simulations and planned strategies and prepared for every possible scenario. Now it was time to see if their preparations would be enough. Cross gave the order to advance. The human fleet moved forward into the chaos of the asteroid field. The Council ships were larger and more powerful, but the asteroids made their size a disadvantage. They could not maneuver quickly enough to avoid collisions. They could not track the smaller human vessels darting between the rocks. Lieutenant Heather Simmons led the first fighter squadron into battle. Her squadron was called the Ghost Riders, and they lived up to their name. The small craft weaved through enemy formations like spirits, appearing from nowhere and vanishing before the Council gunners could target them. Simmons targeted engine cores and weapon systems. She did not try to destroy the massive Council ships outright. That would have been impossible. Instead, she crippled them. A ship without engines was a sitting target. A ship without weapons was useless. Her squadron took losses. Good pilots died in flashes of fire and debris. But they kept fighting. They kept attacking. They gave the Council something they had not experienced in centuries: fear. The Council commander was a Krellian named Torvin. He was old even by Krellian standards, and he had commanded fleets for longer than humanity had possessed space travel. He had never lost a battle. He had never even come close to losing. Now he watched his cruisers burn and felt something cold spreading through his chest. Torvin ordered a full assault on Earth itself. If the humans would not surrender their fleet, he would destroy their homeworld. He would burn their cities and boil their oceans and leave nothing but ash and memory. Then the fleet would have nothing left to protect. The Council bombers broke from the main formation and accelerated toward the blue planet hanging in the distance. There were hundreds of them, enough to level every continent, enough to end human civilization in a single day. But General Kevin Shaw was waiting. Orbital defense platforms activated across Earth's sky. Some were old military satellites that had been upgraded with new weapons. Others were civilian stations that had been converted during the 90 days. All of them opened fire at once. Ground-based laser arrays joined the assault. Massive installations that drew power directly from fusion reactors sent beams of concentrated light into space. Missile silos hidden in mountains and under oceans launched their payloads. Electromagnetic pulse generators fired invisible waves that scrambled bomber electronics thought the first wave of Council bombers never reached the atmosphere. They died in a storm of fire and metal and light. The second wave fared no better. By the time Torvin called off the assault, he had lost half his bomber force and not a single human city had been touched. The battle raged for 3 days. Neither side rested. Neither side retreated. Ships were destroyed and crews died and debris spread across millions of kilometers of space. The human carrier Vigilance was lost on the second day. An enemy battleship caught it in a crossfire and tore it apart. The entire crew of 4,000 went down with the ship. There were no escape pods. There was no time. Captain Derek Lane led a destroyer squadron in defense of the lunar colonies. When Council landing craft tried to seize Luna Base, Lane positioned his ships directly in their path. He fought until his ammunition was gone and his engines were dead. Then he ordered his remaining crew to evacuate and rammed his destroyer into the lead landing craft. Both ships were destroyed. The landing was stopped. On the third day, the Council fleet was bleeding. They had lost nearly a third of their ships. Their formations were scattered. Their commanders were arguing over tactics that had not worked, but the human fleet was bleeding too. Cross had lost half his carriers and 2/3 of his fighters. The Defiance itself had taken heavy damage. Fires burned in the lower decks and half the weapon systems were offline. Cross knew that both sides were near breaking. The next few hours would decide everything. He gathered his remaining ships for one final push. The target was Torvin's flagship, a massive vessel called the Dominion. It was the command center of the entire Council fleet. If it fell, the enemy would lose coordination. They might retreat. They might surrender. The Defiance led the charge. It was joined by every human ship that could still fight. They formed a wedge and drove straight into the heart of the Council formation. Torvin tried to flee. He ordered his flagship to jump to hyperspace. But human fighters had already disabled his jump drives. He was trapped. Cross opened a communication channel. His face appeared on screens across both fleets. He was covered in dust and blood from a head wound. But his eyes were clear and his voice was steady. "You wanted tribute," he said to Torvin. "Here it is." He ordered the Defiance to full speed and aimed directly at the Dominion. The two ships collided. Cross detonated the carrier's reactors. The explosion consumed both vessels in nuclear fire. Admiral Daniel Cross died in that fire. But so did Torvin. And so did the Council's hope of victory. The remaining Council ships fled. They jumped to hyperspace and ran back to their masters with tales of horror and defeat. Humanity had won the Battle of Earth, but the war was far from over. The news of the defeat spread across the galaxy faster than any ship could travel. Communication networks carried the story from system to system and world to world. The Galactic Council, the rulers of 1,000 stars, the masters of 12 species, had been beaten by primitives, by newcomers. by a species that had only learned to travel between planets a few centuries ago. The recordings were the worst part. Council observers had documented everything, thinking they would be recording humanity's surrender. Instead, they had recorded something else entirely. They had recorded humans dying with laughter on their lips. They had recorded pilots flying broken ships into enemy vessels rather than eject. They had recorded soldiers fighting hand-to-hand in the corridors of captured stations, biting and clawing when their weapons ran dry. The elder species watched these recordings and felt fear for the first time in living memory. On the Council homeworld, the 12 ruling species gathered in emergency session. The great hall where they met was ancient beyond measure. Its walls were carved with the names of every species that had submitted to council rule over 10,000 years. There was space at the bottom for humanity's name. That space would remain empty now. Vexor Prime stood before the assembly and demanded vengeance. He called for a second fleet to be assembled, a force so massive that no planet could resist it. He wanted humanity erased from existence. He wanted their worlds sterilized and their colonies destroyed. He wanted future species to look at where Earth had been and see only a warning. But the other species hesitated. The Krellians had lost their finest commander in the battle. Their military was in disgrace. Half their officers were demanding investigations into how such a disaster could have happened. The other half were quietly updating their wills. The Mordavians had never been warriors. They had surrendered to the Council 2,000 years ago and had served as laborers and technicians ever since. They had no fleet to contribute and no stomach for more fighting. The Vexori themselves were divided. Vexor Prime spoke for the ruling caste, but the lower castes were whispering different words. They were whispering about a species that had looked at the Council's power and said no. They were wondering if perhaps they could say no as well. No second fleet was approved. Secretary General Lisa Monroe had survived the Battle of Earth. She had watched from a bunker beneath the Parliament building as the orbital defenses fired and the Council bombers burned in the sky. She had wept when she learned of Admiral Cross's sacrifice. She had wept for all the thousands who had given their lives. But she did not have time for grief. Humanity had won a battle, not a war. The Council still existed. Their territory still spanned half the galaxy. They could rebuild their fleet and return. Unless something changed, this victory would only delay the inevitable. Monroe sent a message to every species in the Council's domain. It was transmitted on every frequency and in every language that humanity had learned during the fight. The message was simple and direct. She told them that humanity was not their enemy and never had been. She told them that humans had not started this conflict. The Council had come to Earth with demands for tribute and threats of destruction. Humanity had simply refused to accept slavery. She told them that the Council could be beaten. The battle recordings proved that 10,000 years of dominance had made the Council soft and slow. They had forgotten how to fight. They had forgotten what it meant to face an enemy that would not surrender. And then she told them something that changed everything. She told them that if they wanted freedom, humanity would help them take it. If they rose up against their masters, they would not stand alone. Earth would be their ally. Earth would fight beside them. The message reached the Mordavian colony worlds first. For 2,000 years, the Mordavians had worked in mines and factories across the galaxy. They had built ships and weapons and infrastructure for their conquerors. They had been taught that resistance was impossible and that obedience was the only path to survival. But now they watched the recordings from Earth. They saw humans who had been told the same thing and had chosen to fight anyway. They saw what courage looked like. The first uprising happened on a mining colony in the outer territories. Mordavian workers seized control of the processing facilities and locked out the Council overseers. When security forces arrived to crush the rebellion, They found the workers had armed themselves with mining equipment. The fighting lasted 3 days. The Mordavians won. More uprisings followed. Factory worlds stopped producing. Transport routes were disrupted. The flow of tribute that kept the council running began to slow. The Vexury labor castes were next. They were the ones who built the council's ships and maintained its stations. Without them, the machinery of empire ground to a halt. They did not fight with weapons. They simply stopped working. They sat down in their workshops and refused to move. The council could not kill them all. There would be no one left to fix anything. The Krellian military fractured into civil war. One faction blamed the defeat at Earth on poor leadership and demanded changes. Another faction wanted to execute the surviving officers for cowardice. A third faction quietly began making contact with human diplomats. Ambassador Nicole Grant traveled to neutral space to meet with representatives of the rebelling species. She was a young woman who had been a trade negotiator before the council's arrival. She had never expected to be making deals that would reshape the galaxy. She carried a simple proposal: alliance. The Mordavians agreed immediately. They had the most to gain and the least to lose. They were already fighting and already dying. Human support would give them a chance to actually win. The Trellic were more cautious. They were a small species with only 3 colony worlds. They feared council retaliation if they joined an alliance that failed. Grant promised them protection. She promised that humanity would not abandon its friends. The sanctuary worlds were a collection of species that had been too small or too weak to resist the council on their own. They had been reduced to servant status centuries ago. They had almost forgotten what freedom felt like. Grant reminded them. One by one, they agreed. Mordavians, Trellic, sanctuary worlds. Free Vexury, who had escaped their caste system. Former Krellian officers who had chosen honor over loyalty. The alliance was born in a small station orbiting a neutral moon. It had no official name at first. The representatives simply called it the Coalition. It was small and fragile and faced an enemy that still controlled most of the galaxy. But it was growing. And the council was shrinking. Secretary General Monroe received word of the alliance formation in her office on Earth. She read the report and allowed herself a small smile. The Galactic Council had made a mistake when they came to Earth. They had thought they were dealing with just another species waiting to be conquered. They had not understood that sometimes the smallest spark can start the largest fire. Now that fire was spreading, and it would not stop until the council burned. 2 years passed since the Battle of Earth. 2 years of war and diplomacy and sacrifice. 2 years of slow, grinding progress as the Coalition pushed back against Council territory system by system and world by world. The Council was wounded but not dead. They still controlled the core systems. They still had the largest fleet in the galaxy. They still believed they could win. The final confrontation would happen at Nexus Prime, the Council's capital system. It was the oldest continuously inhabited system in the galaxy. The homeworld of the Vexury ruling caste orbited a yellow star at its center. The planet was covered in ancient cities and towering monuments to 10,000 years of dominance. If the council fell here, they fell everywhere. Fleet Admiral Nathan Price stood on the bridge of the command ship Unity. He had been Cross's second during the Battle of Earth. He had survived that nightmare by pure luck, when his ship was one of the few that avoided destruction. The weight of command had been given to him after Cross's death, and he had carried it every day since. The Allied fleet gathered at the edge of the system. 1,500 warships from a dozen species. Human carriers and destroyers. Mordavian dreadnoughts built in secret in the mines their people had once worked as slaves. Trellic cruisers fast and light like the species that crewed them. Free Vexury vessels stolen from council shipyards by defectors, who had chosen freedom over caste. it was the largest Allied fleet ever assembled. It was still outnumbered 2-1. The Council had gathered everything they had left. 3,000 ships defended Nexus Prime. Every species that still remained loyal had contributed vessels. The fleet was positioned in defensive formations around the planet. They were not going to repeat the mistakes of the Battle of Earth. This time, they would not underestimate their enemy. Secretary General Monroe watched from the Unity as the battle began. She was too old for combat and too important to risk, but she had insisted on being present. If humanity was going to write the final chapter of this war, she wanted to witness it. The first wave of the assault was brutal. Price sent his fastest ships forward to draw enemy fire. The Trellick cruisers started through council formations, weaving between larger vessels and launching missiles at close range. They died by the dozens, but they opened gaps in the defensive lines. Mordavian dreadnoughts followed. These were massive ships, slow but nearly impossible to destroy. The Mordavians had built them in secret over the past 2 years using knowledge they had gained from centuries of building council vessels. They knew every weakness in enemy designs, because they had been forced to fix those designs for generations. The Dreadnought Liberator led the assault. It pushed through concentrated fire that would have destroyed any other ship. Its hull cracked and burned, but it kept moving. It absorbed damage meant for the carriers behind it. When its weapons finally fell silent, it had taken 17 enemy ships with it. The crew fought until the last section lost atmosphere. None of them surrendered. None of them tried to escape. Human fighters entered the battle in swarms. Lieutenant Samantha Drake led the assault wing designated to breach the planetary defenses. She was 26 years old and had been a shuttle pilot before the war. She had learned to fight in the burning skies above Earth 2 years ago. She had lost friends and found purpose in equal measure. Her squadron punched through the orbital defenses and entered the atmosphere of Nexus Prime. Council interceptors pursued them through towering clouds and across mountain ranges. Drake lost half her pilots in the first 10 minutes. She kept flying. The target was the planetary shield generator. It was a massive installation built into the tallest mountain on the northern continent. The shield protected the council chamber where the 12 ruling species cowered and watched their empire crumble. As long as the shield stood, ground forces could not land. Drake made 3 attack runs. The first 2 failed. Defensive fire was too heavy, and her remaining pilots were too few. On the 3rd run, she ordered her squadron to fly in close formation directly at the generator's main power coupling. 4 pilots went in. Only Drake came out. The generator exploded behind her as she climbed back toward orbit. The planetary shield flickered and died. Ground forces landed within the hour. Sergeant Paul Hendricks led the assault on the council chamber itself. He was a Marine who had fought on Luna during the Battle of Earth. He had been in the tunnels when Council landing craft tried to seize the base. He had killed his first alien soldier with a mining pick when his rifle ran out of ammunition. His team landed on the steps of the Council building under heavy fire. Automated defenses and elite guards stood between them and the chamber doors. The fighting was close and brutal. Hendricks lost men and women with every room they cleared. But they kept pushing forward. When they reached the chamber doors, Hendricks kicked them open himself. The 12 representatives of the Galactic Council sat in a semicircle on elevated platforms. They were ancient beings, some of them thousands of years old. They had ruled an empire that spanned countless stars. They had commanded fleets and controlled populations and decided the fates of entire species. Now they looked at the human soldiers standing in their doorway and saw their end approaching. Hendricks walked slowly to the center of the chamber. His armor was scorched and dented. His rifle was empty. But he did not need a weapon anymore. It is over, he said. The Council surrendered. The war ended not with a final explosion, but with a quiet document signed in the chamber where so many species have been sentenced to servitude. The tributary system was abolished. Every species under council control was granted sovereignty. The coalition would become something new. A galactic assembly where all species had equal voice. Secretary General Monroe gave the closing address at the first assembly session. She stood before representatives of dozens of species who had gathered to build something that had never existed before. A galaxy based on freedom instead of fear. She told them that humanity had not wanted war. Humans had not sought to build an empire or conquer the stars. They had only wanted what every being deserved: the right to stand on their own feet and choose their own path. The council had tried to take that right away. They had demanded tribute and threatened destruction, and humanity had refused to kneel. But this was not about humanity alone, she said. Every species gathered in this chamber had made the same choice. Every one of them had looked at the power of the council and decided that freedom was worth dying for. Every one of them had earned their place at this table. She looked around the chamber at the faces of former enemies and new friends, at species that had been slaves for thousands of years and species that had only just reached the stars, at a galaxy that had been broken and was now being rebuilt. We did not do this for ourselves, she said. We did it for everyone who comes after us, for every species that will reach for the stars in generations to come. They will look at what we built here and know that freedom is possible. They will know that no matter how powerful the enemy seems, courage is stronger than fear. The assembly rose in applause. Humanity had refused to kneel, and in doing so, they had taught the galaxy to stand.